Thank you very much, Mr. Royo. And now I'd like to welcome Nico Krisch to also give an opening statement.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Really, I just want to make a few introductory remarks on the kinds of questions that we're confronting here, because in many ways, the rise of independence movements in Europe is a phenomenon that could potentially change quite a bit of the political landscape in Europe. And I want to ask a few questions of how we might want to respond to that. I'm not going to go into the details of the different processes. We know about Scotland, about Catalonia. We've just heard quite a bit. There are other latent cases, one could say, in Europe, especially in Belgium, others in Spain, the Basque Country, in Italy, and probably beyond that. And some people have warned that if some of these become independent or the independence process progresses, there may be a domino effect of encouraging others. So it might be that sort of at the end of that process, the landscape in Europe looks quite different from the way it looks so far. Now, the reasons for all these different movements are themselves quite different, and I'm not going to go into the details here. I think it's important to note, though, that they are all of them not really your classical fight against oppressive situations in the countries that minorities are embedded in. So the classical fight for independence against oppression. They are driven in part, I think, in most of these places by some sense of discrimination, a lack of recognition of the particularities of the cultural, linguistic, political groups in a particular part of the overall countries. And they're driven by an idea that the political goals of that group are better pursued closer to home, in a smaller setting, in which people have a better sense of self-government and a better possibility to achieve goals in terms of welfare, education, the fight against corruption, infrastructure investments, and the like. I think all of them ask a question. The question is sort of, why should we be bound to be in a state that is only really sort of partly ours, that we don't really feel fully part of, and we don't feel that the others really take us as seriously as they should as constituent parts. So that is a short and certainly contestable depiction of the initial problem, but I want to really talk more about sort of how should we address those kinds of questions, both sort of within the countries concerned, but also perhaps more on the European level as a question of how Europe ought to look like. Now, one question, and one obviously as a lawyer I tend to talk about, is law, and constitutional law gives us some answers, but typically rather restrictive answers. In most countries, it doesn't allow for much of independence of parts, as we've heard. In Spain, the constitution speaks of the indissoluble unity of Spain, and the Spanish government is enforcing that rather heavy-handedly. But other constitutions are not necessarily that different. International law doesn't offer us that much, because the right to self-determination, sort of the one locus in which this can be discussed, offers very restrictive conditions, if any at all, for possible secession from a state, if at all, in situations, in rather extreme cases, either decolonization or massive human rights violations. So that's a regime that really doesn't give much ground here. It's a regime based on the overall approach to stabilize the international system rather than face disruption by secessionist movements. And European law within the European Union doesn't tell us anything much about how possibly the European Union should deal with these processes, or potentially with the new states that arise from them, and especially around the Scottish case. There's been quite a debate on what should be done. The default position for many is that a new state, like Scotland, should have been treated like any other state that aspires to become a member of the European Union, and therefore sort of a candidate state for accession. But that's obviously complicated, time-consuming, potentially disruptive. Now, law, of course, is not really the end of the story, and it may be strange for a lawyer to say, but in that case, there's much else, really, that we want to look to. Law, especially both constitutional law and international law, and likewise European law, it's always a political product made in certain circumstances, power constellations, and it shouldn't necessarily be the yardstick for how you should deal with these kinds of problems. Now, the UK, in its dealing with Scotland, took a decidedly non-legal approach in the sense of engaging in a political dialogue and trying to convince Scots that they should vote to stay within the Union rather than outside, authorizing Scotland, though, to hold a referendum on independence. And I think there are many reasons for why one should favor such a more open dialogical approach. And probably the main argument is one that is indeed sort of used by many of the defenders as one from democracy. Democratic theory is typically more permissive of forms of self-determination and even secession than the classical legal discourses around self-determination would be. There's some sort of radical secessionists among the choice theorists, but still, I mean, sort of broadly speaking, I think they're more positively minded, and that's rather understandable, because if you think about the promise of democracy, it's a promise to take democracy all the way down, also to take democracy to the definition of the political community you want to be part of. Now, if that's the case, then obviously democracy should also be about boundaries and how states should be composed. And it will be clear to most that simply ignoring the views of the populations that live in a given territory is not a particularly democratic approach. It doesn't mean that necessarily the alternative should be the possibility of unilateral secession, because of course there are lots of complicated questions waiting to define who should be involved in the definition of those boundaries, sort of which groups should matter, and sort of how you balance the wishes of an overall population with the wishes of a part. But at least it points us towards thinking that we should acknowledge voices and political processes to form opinions about this in these overall settings. Also, we should think that Europe is in a very different situation than most of the places in which often self-determination and secession issues arise. Fortunately, in most of Europe, we're not facing as much of a risk of destabilization and strife and all that. We are in a context that is relatively stably and consolidatedly civil. So in a sense, that gives, of course, Europe space to allow for more of that democratic promise, and to take the democratic aspect of all this rather seriously. I should also say that I think the being within Europe is probably one really important factor behind the rise of the independence movements that we're seeing, because thinking, so being inside Europe, you don't need to be part of a bigger state necessarily. You're already part of a much bigger political entity that determines you in many ways, and so the things that you still can influence, you might want to influence at a lower level. You don't need the big state for most of the public goods provisions that now are taken care of in a European context. Now, if we think of this in these terms, Europe might think of itself just as well, not just as an international organization in the way it is currently approaching those questions, leaving them to the internal affairs of their member states and handling new states as potential accession states. That's what international organizations typically do. But Europe is not a typical international organization, the European Union. In many ways, it understands itself much more like a federation, or somewhat similar to a federal structure. Federal states typically have rules on how they deal with internal enlargement. They're very different rules. The US has a very restrictive one, requiring the consent of the affected states. India has a very different one, allowing for federal legislation, the federal legislature to affect the reorganization of the states within the Indian Federation. However that might be, I think it's important that the European Union starts formulating an approach to these matters that is not simply standoffish and says, well, that's all internal, and we're not dealing with this, because by default, the European Union is dealing with it in one way or the other. Now, I don't want to take up much more of your time, really. But I want to end by asking, well, that might all be fine, and talking about democracy in Europe all sounds nice, but is this really an approach that is worth pursuing in the 21st century? Or aren't we, as Joseph Weiler, the president of the European University Institute, has intimated, recently, aren't we going here towards some form of Euro-tribalism, some separatist nationalism that reminds us of the early 20th century and all the strife that happened within countries? And shouldn't Europe encourage a more inclusive, integrative ethos that brings us all together rather than drives us apart? In many ways, I think that's very much worth thinking about, and obviously it would be very helpful if everybody would be integrative and enlightened in that way. At the same time, I think the argument misses quite a bit of the point, because precisely the movements that we see today, and that's quite distinctive about them as well, are not movements of ethnic nationalism and separation in the way that many of the early 20th century movements were. They actually, if you look at the proposals for citizenship and participation that come out of them, are rather inclusive, pretty much more inclusive than many of the state processes that they are coming from. So maybe there's quite a different character. It might all be well to say that within the European Union and globalization, the state becomes less important, and we shouldn't be fixated on new states. And so populations shouldn't be fixated on creating a new state in these situations. But at the same time, for most of the issues that concern us, the state is still the most important side of political decision making. And so it's quite clear why there's a stake in having a state, even if you would rather transcend it. And that's especially so for minorities that feel that they are structural minorities within systems, and they feel that they're not sufficiently heard and respected within those systems. Now, so we might think, well, should this drive us towards having more and more independent states or more and more member states of the European Union, if the population so choose? We might want to think of other political forms. We may think of things in more postmodern or neo-medieval terms and think of hybrid structures that are not all organized around statehood. But however that might be, and however we might want to organize such hybridity, I think it's quite clear that we shouldn't keep ignoring that issue, as the European Commission, for example, has tried to do for long. I think the movements that we're seeing are politically too strong to do that, and they are there for good reason. The promise of democracy, that is a very European Union style promise, is really encouraging the expression of people that they want to be determinative of their political futures and the structures that they live in, and simply reminding them of the need to face the disciplines of the multinational states that they are part of will be hardly enough. All right, I'm going to finish here. I think there are loads of questions really we can answer, or first pose, and I'm very happy that we're going to have such an amazing panel to deal with them. Thank you.